computer. Hey, Barry, good morning. How are you doing?
I am doing fine, Michael. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing okay. Thank you very much.
We're both
Today,
in our offices, and
it's very official feeling today.
feeling official and corporate as we talk about Marxism and other things.
Yeah, today is Stuart Hall. And so we are going to be talking about his essay, Encoding and Decoding, which is an oldie but a goodie. This is 1980. And the thinking here was to look at this and really see how it holds up and how it may still be useful. I know that in some of the communication courses I teach, I start with the idea of encoding and decoding and just talking about how language works. And so I think that the plan today, if we follow the plan, is going to be to take his ideas and map them onto the contemporary digitized media landscape. And
so that's what you meant by relevant, that we're going to talk about the ways in which these ideas pass over or don't to like the online world, digital culture, media culture. Michael, am I right to think, I seem to have recalled this, and maybe we talked about it. This is, you're talking about, you use this as a foundational, as an important text in communication classes. Am I right to think that this is specifically a key text in television studies?
I think it should be. If it's not, again, that's sort of outside of my wheelhouse. But
his idea of media, like McLuhan. I mean, I'm just saying, I'm saying that because, like McLuhan, I have to mention him.
Have to mention
here,
him.
and I'm going to mention him again. Don't worry, fans. we're going to get there again. But like McLuhan, when he's talking about media in here, he seems to be mostly talking, and the whole model of encoding is from television programming, television broadcasting, and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Yeah, that's certainly his focus in the article. It's funny because one of the things that we're going to get to is what has 40 years done to this. And so yeah, I don't know, maybe that's a bad omen. I didn't even realize we were, it's my fault. Yes, I think that it would certainly be relevant for broadcasting. However, one of the arguments I hope to make in the next hour or so is that
don't undersell yourself. From what I understand, you're going to shatter that paradigm. I'm just mentioning that as a background.
Yeah, well,
as a background guy, I'm just mentioning that. And it reminded me of McLuhan. Hall reminds me of McLuhan in that he's talking about media, but he means television. And that's kind of famously true of McLuhan. He, he's aware of radio. He's aware of 19th century. He's aware that there are, satellite communication. He's aware of other things. He's even aware of computers. But when he talks about media and its effects, he's really thinking about television. That way, the Hall seems to be part of that moment.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Do you, should we get started?
We could. Okay. And I'm just going to continue in my designated role as background man and say two things about there are many things that could be said. If we had a 3-hour episode, God help us, God help everyone, God save everyone. If we had a 3-hour episode on Hall, we could, dilate a lot more on the intellectual context, because I don't think we're going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it. I don't think it will happen much in what you told me about your discourse on it and what you want to use the essay to say. But there's obviously a way in which this essay is impossible to imagine without Roland Barthes, the structural moment, and in particular Barthes. And we talked about Roland Barthes before. Hall, even though he's talking about television, Hall is really interested and informed rather by Barthes' semiotic reading of photographic images, right? The idea of decoding the photographic image, especially as it is in advertising. That's it's hard to imagine this essay without. But But I mentioned that to say that I'm not going to talk about right here when I talk about the context. I'm just going to bring up two other intellectual forces, or two other intellectual history of, I'm just going to talk about the history of ideas. Two other things that seem to be informing Hall and kind of set the bar for Hall, or the foundation of his ideas. There's a McLuhan moment early in the essay. Is this about 3 paragraphs in? Do you want a screen share, or
Yeah, let me. I
I
can pull it up. Let me get this so those of you watching along on YouTube have something to read. Here we go.
Something to read, and you don't have to look at me. It's awesome.
Yeah,
awesome. This is the best thing about media. Forget every other aspect of media. This is what matters. So it's a paragraph. It's pretty early on. This says, "Thus, while in no way," oh hell yeah,
there we go.
We got it. We got it. Just wanted to read this brief bit of it. Thus, while in no way wanting to limit research to following only those leads which emerge from content analysis, we must recognize that the discursive form of the message, already we're getting a little McLuhan tingly here. The form of the message. Ooh. Could the medium be the message? Might be. Could the discursive form of the message has a privileged position in the communicative exchange, and that the moments of encoding and decoding, they're only relatively autonomous. In other words, and in fact, here we see a little, there's the shadow of McLuhan, or the ghost of McLuhan, the specter of McLuhan, sort of haunting this paragraph. But note, he brings him up, he engages him, but he slightly breaks from McLuhan, because the medium isn't the message, right?
Mm-hmm.
The medium is relatively autonomous. All Hall will say is that the message is, the medium is a thing. It exists as a relatively autonomous element in relation to the communicative process as a whole, which constitutes determinate moments. You're going to talk a little bit about what that means, so I won't bother.
Yeah, but I think maybe let's take a second to sort of just pick at this, right?
Sure.
As I understand this, what he's doing is granting, like, if we look at the message as, from its conception to its reception, right? What Hall is doing that McLuhan doesn't is he's including the decoding process of the person who is receiving and interpreting the message into the equation. And McLuhan doesn't really spend any time talking about that.
Well, my friend, that's a wily idea. That's a very interesting idea. Let me ask you a further question. We won't dilate too much further.
No.
We need to go to Marx and from this, but that's a very provocative point, and I wanted to quick follow-up. Do you think, in a sense, that McLuhan should be faulted for not thinking? I mean, this essay, as you just said, it is thinking about the reception side. It's thinking about how audiences decode messages. Is this you're correctly noting this is a point of difference between Hall and McLuhan, even though I believe he's invoking him here. Do you also think that this is a genuine fault of McLuhan? His ideas, he doesn't seem, McLuhan is the master decoder, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's the decoder of media messages that we need to pay attention to. Whereas Hall is kind of democratizing the process, or realizes that there are a lot of decoders that are decoding the encoded message of television or broadcast.
I don't know.
Do you want to? Is this a criticism?
No, but I think it's an interesting question, because it's an orienting question, at least in terms of the way I'm going to answer it. I don't think that Hall and McLuhan are doing the same thing, right? I think that McLuhan is looking at this new social phenomenon, and his, which is television in the home, broadcast television in the home. We've moved beyond the radio. We now have images. And so I think that his his mission, his job, his goal is really to sort of contextualize what this new medium is. You know, Hall is what, 20 years on, right? McLuhan was the 60s.
Yeah.
Okay. So this has become normalizing. We're still, in terms of mass adoption, a little bit before the advent of cable television in every home. So we still have, you know, just that core set of networks. So he's dealing in many ways with something similar, but I think that his purpose is different. He's not.
I agree.
Yeah, I don't think they're the same. I wouldn't fault McLuhan for that because I don't think he's got the same job.
I got no, and that's going to lead to my second and final point, which is that the mentor here, the really foundational ideas that Hall is working with are Marxist ideas.
Mhm.
And also we have to give Raymond Williams a name check, because that's another what Hall, I think, is specifically doing. We have to mention this, is that he's intentionally aligning himself with, he's following up and trying to complete the work or further the work of Raymond Williams,
Mhm.
who was writing about television and media in the 50s and 60s, right? So, you know, that's really Hall's point of orientation. And we'll get to there in a second, but just another place where I feel that McLuhan is here, but as you rightly say, it's like McLuhan represents an atmosphere, right?
Okay.
There's
Yes.
a kind of climate of opinion which which Hall is gesturing to here, that you know, that he doesn't have to mention McLuhan. He's just sort of assimilated McLuhan's idea as a part of the climate of opinion. Okay, last point: message form. This seems the concession to the idea that the medium is a message. The message form is the necessary form of appearance of the televisual event in its passage from source to receiver. Michael, as you said, what Hall is really interested in is this last part of the sentence. And maybe McLuhan isn't as interested in, as you also say, the passage of the message form from source to receiver.
Right.
Okay, so hit me with the other page, next page, and then we can get out of context. Yeah, that paragraph, you're right there. Well, you have to scroll down just a little bit, because I'm going to go to the middle of the paragraph.
Okay.
This is where he brings up something you're going to talk about with greater, you're going to expand on more than I am, but this is one of the places where Hall begins to articulate his notion of production. And
Right.
that's central to the essay, and that's central to this process of encoding and decoding, central part of the process of encoding and decoding that you're going to talk about in a moment. And he uses the metaphor of production. So could you go? Oh, I made you go a little bit too far down. I'll pick it up just a little bit further up, and then I'm going to move to Philip Elliott, if you can see it. Okay, yeah, production here in the television. He's still talking about the televisual image that he's going to argue is encoded and decoded by audiences. Production here constructs the message. But his point is that, see if I can give you a quick summary of the point. Where
so
he's
you're right here. This
yeah, production here constructs the message. But I'm gonna try to summarize the point of this paragraph very briefly, and then move to Philip Elliott to sort of point it out. The larger point of this paragraph in this section is that he wants to say, because production matters, okay, because production matters, I'm going to talk a little bit further in this essay. I'm going to talk a lot about decoding and how audiences can take control of the visual and audio image that they receive on television. But one of the points I want to make, and this is in keeping with a Marxist notion of production, that economic and social forces are in the last instance determining the production of a message, that a message is produced And in a sense, because messages are produced, because a television image is produced, we can't fully separate it from the capitalist mode of production, right? That's the big Marxist idea here. And so one of the things he wants to emphasize is the media image is produced. And the whole point of this paragraph is, he's sort of setting the stage for later. He does not want to say that there's anarchy here. As soon as the televisual image is led upon the world, because of the power of decoding that you're going to talk about, people can just like run license. No, he wants to. And in this, he's trying to be faithful to the Marxist tradition that says modes of production are central. He wants to argue, he's arguing, in fact, that something really vital and important happens to limit the message, to limit and constrain how a message can be decoded, no matter how productive or in how much license audiences have. There is the mode of production is a determining instance, and I'll stop it here. But I don't know if I fear I'm clear as mud. So I think we probably need to do a clarifying question from you. But I'll just end with this.
Go ahead.
So Philip Elliott has expressed this point succinctly within a more traditional framework in his discussion of the way in which the audience is both the source and the receiver of the television message. That last bit is, again, Hall is pointing out that, hey, production matters. The decoding part of the encoding, decoding thing, it matters. Thus, to borrow Marx's terms, circulation and reception are indeed moments. The consumption or reception of the television message is a moment, but the production process in its larger sense is predominant. So anyway, production and reception of the television message are therefore not identical, but they are related.
Right.
And
so
furthermore, one is what the reception is constrained in many ways by the production.
So
maybe that got a little bit clearer there, but if not, let me
ask you a question about this.
Sure.
Because just to clarify this. So he goes on in a bit at length to say, that the televised event is not the event, right? So you're watching, I don't know, an inauguration on television. You are not watching. And this is where I think the overlap with McLuhan comes into play, right? You are not watching the inauguration. You are watching the televised inauguration. So when he talks about the production of an event, and I want to get into, because he's got to just to fully orient everybody here. McLuhan, whoops.
McLuhan.
Hall sees this as a five-stage process that works as a circuit where stage 5 informs stage 1, right? And so those stages are starting with, at his beginning, production, circulation, distribution, consumption, reproduction, back to production. And so when we talk about the production of a message, one of the things that separates McLuhan and his model from Hall's model is McLuhan was looking at the media environment, whereas Hall is less concerned with the environment as a discrete thing. He is more concerned with the message creation, interpretation,
the production of the message.
Right. And so that's where I wanted to start with this, I think, is when we talk about the production of the message, maybe it's helpful to think about what we mean by production, because I think at first blush, this is like, okay, is this the technological voodoo that happens to create something? And that's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about,
part of what he's talking about, but not the totality, I think.
No. So let's fill in the blanks. How do you understand what he means by production?
Well, I'm going to try to answer that question briefly by reference to what he talks about when he, at the very end of the essay, when he talks about television professionals, that he assumes that television, like anything else in professionals matter in the division of labor in a capitalist society. And that's another way in which Hall's Marxist framework sort of shapes the essay. And so he believes in something like a television professional. The job of the television professional is to make a broadcast, to broadcast messages. And so not only are they taking control of the technological aspect of it, but they're also inscribing it with their own language and their own perspective. So I guess we're saying that their ideas or ideology, however you characterize it, their perspectives on the topic they're covering, they're part of what's reproduced through or produced through the technology. Is that helping answer that?
I think so. I think so, because, you know, the essay is entitled Encoding and Decoding, right? And I think what he's talking about in terms of encoding and decoding are really sort of the poles of this process in a way. And so if we look at what he calls production, this is the process of encoding. This is the process of assigning language,
Right,
and assigning images, assigning, creating basically the shell, and then the contents of the shell that hold this message, if I can use that metaphor for this. So what I wanted to talk about with this was, as I read this essay, I was thinking, okay, as we sit here and record this now, this essay is 42, 43 years old. And he's looking at this televisual moment, piggybacking on McLuhan, but then going in a different direction. And I was struck by, and I use this term sort of, I don't have a good way of explaining this other than to say the simplicity of his model when we lay it over top of what the current media landscape and the current means of consuming television are, right? And so what I wanted to talk about, so what initially struck me about this and what has stayed with me as I've been thinking it over for the past week is that his model works in a way, but it's not applicable without a considerable bit of updating. And I think that if we, like, when he's writing this, we have what, 3 networks, 4 networks? There is no
and
cable television.
he is mostly thinking about the Brit and
The BBC, right?
He's mostly thinking about the BBC, and
right.
what, there are 5 or 6 BBC radio stations, and I don't know how, and really only 2 broadcasting networks.
The point being,
at that point.
I guess what I'm looking at, the contradiction in this to today is that he's writing with this idea of a dominant stream. In fact, he talks about the terms that jumped out at me was the idea of the iconic sign, and the dominant cultural perspective on things. And I was thinking, like, wow, we don't have that, but we still have media, we still have production, we still have all of the stages that he's talking about, but somewhere the model got broken. And so my response to this was like, okay, well, where and how did the model get broken? And is there a connection between that rupture or that break and what we currently see in media consumption? And so to clarify this a little bit, the idea for me of a dominant, well, let's back up before we get to dominant media or dominant interpretations of things. You know, this idea of an iconic sign, right? So let me find in the text where this is, and I can bring this back up. In fact, let me do it maybe a little. Okay. I'm struggling here with my.
While you're searching, I'm gonna fill. Oh, you found.
There we go. Okay.
Let me just say one quick comment though before you take it away, Maestro. You used an interesting word. You were struck by the simplistic nature of of the environment that, or the media situation that Hall is describing, and I agree. I wonder if another word for simplicity, I think this is what you're going to get at. Another word for simplicity is, what you're noticing and calling simplistic is the difference between a centralized media structure.
That's fair.
And a decentralized, dispersed media structure.
I think that's fair. And I think that that's my problem here.
Okay.
So he talked, let me see, the television sign is a complex one. It is. And so, when we're talking about signs, again, I think maybe we have to make sure we're speaking the same language here, right? This is dipping into semiotics and linguistics and sign and signified signifier and all that. But basically, the idea that Hall is playing with is that language is a tool. Language, and in his case, also images, right, are tools used to represent the real lived experience. That there's a space between the way that we encode these experiences and the experiences themselves. Would you say that's fair? Is that
It is fair. I'm only smiling because this paragraph has my favorite sentence in the, to illustrate what you just said. This paragraph has my favorite sentence in the essay, and it illustrates directly what you said. The dog in the film can bark.
Can't bite. So I don't even know where that is.
So there's a reality. Well, it's what you were saying. Reality exists outside language, as he also continues to say. But there is, this is part of his structuralist moment, like you were pointing out. There is a specificity to the image of the dog.
Mm-hmm. Well, so here's where I was going with this, right? He says here, the television sign is a complex one. It is itself constituted by the combination of two types of discourse, visual and oral. Moreover, it is an iconic sign in Pierce's terminology because it possesses some of the properties of the thing represented. And so he's got this idea that there is a way to encode in language or in images something that actually has the essence of the thing being encoded. And my interpretation of that is that this essence, the possession of the essence, in some way brings us closer to the real and is therefore more reliable. And again, what struck me was the fact that we seem to exist in a media moment now where the idea of reliable across a cultural landscape is just anathema to the world we're in, right? Nothing is reliable. There is no trust in the legitimacy of the language, or of the not the language, excuse me, of the media that we consume. And so he goes on and he talks about, let me just use the search function here, the dominant interpretations of things. Where was this here? That's predominant. That's not quite what I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. Let's go to the dominant culture.
We say dominant.
What's that? Here we go. Here we go.
I'm just treading water here.
You're fine. Connotative codes are not equal among themselves. Any society culture tends, with varying degrees of closure, to impose its classification on the social and cultural and political world. These constitute a dominant cultural order, though it is neither univocal nor uncontested. This question of the structure of discourses in dominance is a crucial point. The different areas of social life appear to be mapped out into discursive domains, hierarchically organized into dominant or preferred meanings. This really struck me, this idea of a dominant or preferred meaning. If we go, so let me stop there for a second and sort of, circle the wagons and reorient myself here. Hall identifies 5 stages to the circuit of media production. Production, circulation, distribution, consumption, and reproduction. Okay.
Press that you can do that.
Yeah, I'm very good. In 1980, with a dominant media, what's the word I'm looking for? Institution, right? A dominant media voice, whatever it is. Those 3 are going to largely be controlled by the BBC, whomever it is that he's referencing, right? Consumption and reproduction become sort of the outliers. What's interesting now is if we update this to our current situation, anybody, as we are proving at the moment, any 2 people with a computer can recreate a televisual experience that is international in scope, right? the production, the circulation, the distribution of messages is no longer constrained in this Marxist model. It has now become widely available to anybody. This problematizes, as his model says, right? Each of these 5 steps is independent, but influenced by the steps next to it.
Right.
Well, the mass democratization of the production, circulation, distribution problematizes consumption, which then in turn affects reproduction, which then in turn feeds back in to the production. And so as I'm reading this and I'm thinking about this, I'm like, wow, how is it that our world, I know YouTube doesn't like it when we drop F-bombs, so I'm going to be careful here. How is it that our world
is get demonetized?
Yeah, I don't want that. I'd like to get monetized to be demonetized. How is
it pre-monetized?
That's it. We're pre-monetized. How is it that the democratization of something screws something up? That's the question.
Well, what is it screwing up?
Well, why are we so fractured now? Why is there such distrust?
Oh, you mean the emotional effect, the affect of the dispersal.
Yeah.
But do you think that the dispersal is the problem? You don't think the dispersal is a problem. Michael, let's signal to our viewers and listeners. I think we reached the money moment now. We're now going to, we reached the money moment. This is the money moment of the essay. You've just given us the money moment.
I do think
dominant is no longer the dominant.
No, that's the problem, is when we have given, when everybody has a voice.
Right.
What do you get? I mean, I feel like it is now no longer a case of the dominant voice. It is now a case of everybody's got a voice.
Right.
We've totally whitewashed the idea of the dominant. And now all you need is the means of production, circulation, and distribution to in turn access.
Means. You mean just the technological?
Yeah, all you need is the technology to access the voice of your choosing. And
I got you.
I think that's a big problem.
I got you. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, I think. I mean, what do you think? So
okay,
yeah,
I'm just saying that we reached the money moment here.
So what do you?
I don't have it. I have 2 questions for you.
Okay.
And I have partial answer to them, but I think we reached the money moment. You've asked the $1 million question. Okay, so I have a question for you, and maybe I have 2 questions for you, and I think those 2 questions for you and our dialogue about those 2 questions is going to bring this episode to a pleasing whole.
Let's hope
so. Going to bring it all together. It's going to be wonderfully unified in a pleasing totality. Okay, here's the first question. What you pointed out, and I think definitively, and I felt it too, I think any reader, you've done us a service, because I think any reader of the essay, thinking about our media moment and looking back at Hall and saying, what the hell? The dominant, we don't have a dominant. What we have is a dispersal, okay? Could not agree more. And I think that's a very important point. And that any reader of this essay is going to have to struggle with that or to come to terms with it. Okay. So I have 2, I don't know if I have an answer to that question. It's such a great question and such a big one. But I have 2 follow-up questions that are kind of going to constitute my answer. So the first question I have for you is this dispersal that you're talking about. Is it the pharmacon? Is it a good thing and a bad thing, or is it primarily a bad thing? What you just told me was that it's primarily a negative thing because the dispersal seems to have determined, to use Hall's word, the dispersal seems to have determined our fracture, our social fracture, our siloing. So I guess my first question for you, for us, is the dispersal a pharmacon, or is it just effed up? Or we effed up?
I'm gonna say I think that it is unquestionably a pharmacon. Because there's value in this, right? Like, I think that the positive side of this is that you open the doors wide. And maybe I'm an idealist here, but you open the doors for people.
I'm with you, brother. Be that person. Be that. Be who you are.
But the problem is, I think it also invites a measure of laziness in the sense that if I'm sitting here with
You're
a
a
single,
Stieglerian through and
oh, I
through,
am.
my friend.
If I'm sitting here with a dominant media, right, that can bring me information that may enlighten me, it may educate me, but it may also challenge perspectives that I have. I'm forced to engage with that on some level. The problem here, and we're proving this, right? Like if you are a McLuhan fanboy or a Stiegler fanboy, man, we're your Huckleberry, right? But at the same time, if you're not,
Niche. It's a
if
real small niche.
but for those of you who fit that niche, you're welcome.
The people who like licorice really like licorice.
But I think that's the point, right? Is the problem is when everything's available, what are you going to go get? You're going to go get your licorice, right? You're not going to go challenge it. It's I think it's the rare. It's certainly not the majority, and we need it to be the majority to be wholly productive, that we'll go find challenging perspectives. And the other problem that we have with this, yes, it's good we have voices, but no, because in having so many voices, what have we done to a dominant interpretation? What have we done to the idea of a dominant anything at this point? Like, I think that you have a problem when you have a situation like this because you provide a home for radicalism. You provide a home for everything, right? And there are certain, and this is the tricky thing, there are certain everythings that we don't like. There's certain everythings we don't want. But you can't, like, I don't know. I guess this is sort of like the problem that Facebook's been hiding, or Meta has been hiding behind, right? Like, how do we provide a platform for people and then silence the people who do what we think is bad? It's not our place to be bad. And quite frankly, I think it's a cop-out, but I don't know what that answer is. So yeah, I think it's a pharmacon. I mean, where do you stand on that? Can something be wholly bad? Are we that depressed and cynical?
No, I agree with you that it's a pharmacon, but I have a follow-up question that's gonna, and I'll comment on, but I think we're wrapping up here because I think we've reached not just the money moment, but we've reached the moment where I'm losing language, right? And I think you pointed out a problem that's really, I mean, the problems or the problematic, right, that you're describing. It's a kind of structural problem, right? I don't know, we're not going to have to address it. We're going to have to worry about it again in another form. But a related question, and you are already saying it, and maybe you're going to think this is stupid, but I would like to hear your answer. I'd like to hear you sort of tell me why this is stupid. Okay, we're talking about the dispersal. The great dispersal that's happened because of technological democratizing of technology to a certain extent. We're talking about the great dispersal, and we say the dispersal has fractured a universal, has fractured the dominant. I was going to ask you this, though. I have a nagging, what if I said to you that we still have a dominant? That, okay, you're right. The other media studies podcasts where they don't have McLuhan and Stiegler fanboys, they're different from us. And that's why the McLuhan and Stiegler fanboys and girls should come to us, everybody. But we're not there are other things. We haven't yet been urging the overthrow of the government, the violent takeover of the government.
Let's not
and
do
chances
that.
are our competing podcasts, not all of them are doing that either, right? So you have micro niches for sure, but do you really, doesn't that constitute a consensus? Are we that sure that there isn't a dominant? Are we that sure that radical ideas are indeed minority ideas that are radical? Now, you're right. The decentralization allows radical, quote unquote, views on any spectrum a greater prominence than it has certainly was true in Hall's time. But what I'm wondering, and I'm wondering aloud, I don't know the answer to this either, but that's kind of my final It's like I said, this is the money moment, but simply because I'm at the limits of my thought, because I wonder whether or not the dispersal has left a form of the dominant intact.
Let me
Are we really that nichified?
let me point you back to Mr. Hall, because I think he has an answer for this that is maybe where we want to go. Okay. So I'm going to share the screen again. And for those of you listening, I will read this as well. But he says, so I'm starting here. The dominant definitions, however, are hegemonic precisely because they represent definitions of situations and event which are in dominance, global. Dominant definitions connect events implicitly or explicitly to grand totalizations, to the great syntagmic views of the world. They take large views of issues. They relate events to the national interest or to the level of geopolitics, even if they make these connections in truncated, inverted, or mystified ways. The definition of a hegemonic viewpoint is A, that it defines within its terms the mental horizon, the universe of possible meanings of a whole sector of relationships in a society or culture. B, and this is the important one, that it carries with it the stamp of legitimacy. It appears coterminous with what is natural, inevitable, taken for granted about the social order. Okay, so if we think about that, yes, it's entirely possible that you have a measure of confluence among voices, right? However, we are still going to privilege the voices we like over the over the voices that we like less. So while we can all agree about particular things, if it works out that way, there is still the question of legitimacy. And when you have a multitude of voices, you are going to grant legitimacy to those voices you like best. And when they happen to say the same things, that's great. We have a dominant view, right? So we can all agree, for example, that, I don't know, apple pie tastes good. And we have consensus, and that's great. And it's a dominant view.
Okay.
But the second somebody says, look, apple pie tastes good, but it's bad for you. It's bad for you. Well, those voices that we grant legitimacy to that say it's bad for you are now going to give us that off ramp of the dominant and say, well, all those people who are still enjoying their apple pie don't understand. They don't know as well. And this idea of the dominant and what the dispersal, as you're calling it, which I love that term, is doing, is it is really creating a situation where we get to choose our version of the right, the correct. And what's happened is that we're all speaking the same language. We're all using the same signs, right? The same words. But we have now opened up a series of fissures whereby we can be correct and disagree with the mass because our camps look complete to us, right? If you tune into this podcast and you listen to the two of us talk, and this is where you get your information on media studies, then this is what is. And if there are bigger, more popular, more visible, more dominant voices out there, you don't have to hear them, right? So the question of, and this is back to the pharmacon again, I think that the question of access, the democratization of media, has also led to a sort of an unnatural leveling of media, where voices that shouldn't have the the power behind them suddenly have a means of representing or presenting themselves, I should say, as maybe more authentic or legitimate than they should. So I don't know. I mean, let me throw the question back at you. If we look at this and the question of dominant in terms of perceived legitimacy, what do you think? Is this?
I think, I'm going to throw the question back at you, or to both of us. Maybe you already did this with your apple pie example, but I was about to say this. is what if I,
Oh.
I'll make the statement. Capitalism is a bad thing. Is that a dominant view or not? Is your answer to that, okay, I'm going to try to answer that in the way, don't answer that, because I'm going to try to answer it in the terms that I think you are outlining. Okay, so let's do a view. I guess I'm going to follow your apple pie moment. I'll take a statement about a political statement. Capitalism is a bad thing. If I say that, is it a dominant view? As I understand what you're saying, is that because of a different kind of consciousness among media users, among podcast listeners, there are more people who are willing to say, oh, you know, to respect that opinion than say previously. That might be one thing you're saying, but I think you're also saying, if I understand you correctly, that it isn't CBS or NBC or a broadcast network that or Fox. I think let me, you know, Fox complicates it, but let me try.
I don't think it does though. Keep going.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to answer this in your terms to make sure I understand your terms. What you're saying is, okay, I'm presented with a statement. Capitalism is a bad thing. And you're saying, I no longer think of a single determinate source, media source, and then refer to it. I'm probably listen and refer to it and then check that statement for accuracy against my previous knowledge of a central media source. Instead, you say, chances are I'm going to respond to that as a truism and respect it as a universal truth in regard to the other podcasts I'm listening to. So that seems to be the dynamic, that I'm getting my cues from other things, other media sources that I'm listening to, because there's a plethora. There's no longer limited to a handful set of authoritative media sources. So if I understand it, you're answering the question about whether or not there's a dominant, and you're saying there's not a dominant, there's a dispersal. You're saying that no, the dominant is not recreated because we are answering the truths of plain media. We're checking their accuracy against our other media, against other media sources. And depending on those media sources, we're going to respond to that statement. We're going to decode that statement as a truth or not.
I think we're close. Let me try it this way.
Yeah. I'm trying to understand what you know, like what's replaced the determining instant.
Okay,
what's doing the determining?
I think that there is, without a question, a dominant dialogue. So let me get away from apple pie or capitalism for a second. Okay. Let's say that our dominant question is, were the riots of January 6th the criminal moment? Okay. That's a discussion that's being had. Now, the discussion specifically on that is going to be had on multiple channels or through multiple channels. If you identify that as a
okay, you were saying,
yeah, so okay, I apologize for the technical difficulties there. We're back. Anyways, we're talking about the dominant voice and whether or not there is such a thing. And I think that the way I would probably try and respond to that is to say that I think there is a dominant discussion, or there are a series of dominant discussions that take place. The problem is, again, with Hall, we're looking at the entire circuit. So we're looking at the production, the encoding process, everything else. But we're also looking, unlike with McLuhan, we're looking at the decoding of this. And that decoding happens with the dialogues that take place around it. And what's happened, so the example I would give is like the January 6th insurrection. All right. There is a dialogue around this. Everybody in this country is having this dialogue. The question that we come up against is, was that a criminal event or not? Right? Was this patriotic or was this insurrection? And this is where the encoding and the decoding, I think, has to take central stage. This is what McLuhan did not do, but this is what Hall is talking about. The problem is that when we have a media environment such as the one that we do, where any Yahoo can have a podcast, right? There are a million voices to this.
Right.
What happens is we tune in to the voices that support that we like. So where do we grant authenticity or legitimacy? Right. And this creates this in a way, this takes the dominant voice and recodes it. Right. And so when we come back around to the means of production again, right, the decoding of the dominant helps to inform the encoding and shape it shapes the dominant. And so, as much as this works on the plus side of things, where we say, yes, these are problematic, lawless acts that need to be resisted. We suddenly have as many voices on the other side saying, man, this is the new face of, or not the new face, this is the face of patriotism. And those voices of reason now become opposition.
I love your answer. Unfortunately, I think we have a kind of grim conclusion for this episode, because what you just described is the kind of final triumph of consumerism. And I hope I'm wrong on this, so maybe I shouldn't describe it the final triumph, but certainly what you're describing is a triumph of consumerism, and that what's really shaping the decoding is my consumer preferences. So I have these set of consumer preferences regarding the news, regarding music, regarding politics, regarding what have you. And they determine my media intake, the decoding, and eventually, as you brilliantly point out, Pache Hall, they eventually kind of have a feedback loop, and they affect the producers. They affect the production moment. Well, I'm thinking right now of CNN and its rightward turn.
So it's funny because I see that, but to broaden this just a second, so we can shut it down. Think of Spotify, right? How do we listen to the radio now? We don't listen to the radio. No. We tell the radio what to give us. And I guarantee
Consumer preference,
it is. Exactly. And those numbers, those preferences are available to the people who are recording the music because they get paid by them. So it's a perfect example of that, I think. Yeah, it's bleak. But I also suspect that it's bleak because it's the moment we're in. And, I'm going to channel my inner optimism here and say the machine will adapt.
We are both going to channel our inner Stiegler and show and think about moral and intellectual fiber. We're going to apply moral and intellectual fiber as we proceed ahead, as we sojourn on in the digital world.
The takeaway is that we need more fiber.
That's
the answer.
Speaking for myself, Michael. I won't speak for you. I think we're more than done.
I think so. All right. Well, Barry, as always, thank you for the discussion. To those of you who are listening or watching, thank you. Please do subscribe, like, share, pass it on. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, we'd love to hear from you. There's a comment section underneath the video. You can email us at our website, criticalmediastudiespodcast.com. And I think that's it, right? That's the
thanks to our new fans and listeners. I just got a Facebook message from Chaz Williams, and we'll be responding to it in some fashion soon.
Thanks, Chaz. All right. Well, Barry, be well. And we'll talk soon.
Talk soon.
All right.